Hello, everyone. My name is Robert, and I'll be your host today. So, for this series of books, I hope to introduce to you a wide variety of topics covering religion, finance, books I find interesting, and I think you might find interesting too. So, if you're a busy person, don't have time to read, but you do have time to listen to a YouTube podcast, then you're at the right place. So, for today, I'd like to read Neal Stephenson. In the beginning was the command line. If you're not familiar with this author, he's a science fiction slash cyberpunk author. You might even to a degree say alternate history. He's wrote books like Cryptonomicon, which came out in 1999. Snow Crash came out in 1992. The book here, In the Beginning was the command line, which is an essay covering the history of computers going from the 70s to 1999 when this was written. Interesting author. So I hope you'll find this interesting, and I encourage everybody, if you are interested in these books, go ahead and get the actual book. There might be some charts, pictures, and stuff that, of course, obviously you cannot cover during an audio podcast, but get the book yourself, help these authors out, and now sit back and enjoy. Introduction. About 20 years ago, Jobs and Wozniak, the founders of Apple, came up with a very strange idea of selling information processing machines for use in the home. The business took off, and its founders made a lot of money and received the credit they deserved for being daring visionaries. But around the same time, Bill Gates and Paul Allen came up with an idea even stranger and more fantastical: selling computer operating systems. This was much weirder than the idea of Jobs and Wozniak. A computer at least had some sort of physical reality to it. It came in a box, and you could open it up and plug it in and watch lights blink. An operating system had no tangible incarnation at all. It arrived on a disk, of course, but the disk was in fact nothing more than the box that the operating system, or OS, came in. The product itself was a very long string of ones and zeros that, when properly installed and coddled, gave you the ability to manipulate other very long strings of ones and zeros. Even those few who actually understood what a computer operating system was were apt to think of it as a fantastically arcane engineering prodigy, like a breeder reactor or YouTube spy plane, and not something that could ever be, in the parlance of high tech, productized. Yet now the company that Gates and Allen founded is selling operating systems like Gillette sells razor blades. New releases of operating systems are launched as if they were Hollywood blockbusters, with celebrity endorsements, talk show appearances, and world tours. The market for them is vast enough that people worry about whether it has been monopolized by one company. Even the least technically minded people in our society now have at least a hazy idea of what operating systems do. What is more, they have strong opinions about their relative merits. It is commonly understood, even by technically unsophisticated computer users, that if you have a piece of hardware that works on your Macintosh and you move it over onto a Windows machine, it will not run. That this would, in fact, be a laughable and idiotic mistake, like nailing horseshoes to the tires of a Buick. A person who went in a coma before Microsoft was founded and woke up now would probably pick up this morning's New York Times and understand everything in it. Almost. Item. The richest man in the world made his fortune from what? Railways? Shipping? Oil? No. Operating systems. Item. The Department of Justice has tackled Microsoft's supposed OS monopoly with legal tools that were invented to restrain the power of 19th century robber barons. Item. A woman friend of mine recently told me that she's broken off a hitherto stimulating exchange of email with a young man. At first, he had seemed like such an intelligent and interesting guy. She said, but then he started going all PC versus Mac on me. What the hell is going on here? And does the operating system business have a future or only a past? Here is my view, which is essentially subjective. But since I have spent a fair amount of time not only using but programming Macintoshes, Windows machines, Linux boxes, and the BEOS, perhaps it is not so ill informed as to be completely worthless. This is a subjective essay, more review than research paper, and so it might seem unfair or biased compared to the technical reviews you can find in PC magazines. But ever since the Mac came out, our operating systems have been based on metaphors. And anything with metaphors in it is fair game as far as I'm concerned. Next chapter: MGBs, tanks, and Batmobiles. Around the time that Jobs, Wozniak, Gates, and Allen were dreaming up these unlikely schemes, I was a teenager living in Ames, Iowa. One of my friend's dad had an old MGB sports car rusting away in his garage. Sometimes he would actually manage to get it running, and then he would take us for a spin around the block with a memorable look of wild, youthful exhilaration on his face. To his worried passengers, he was a madman, stalling and backfiring around Ames, Iowa, and eating the dust of rusty gremlins and pintos. But in his own mind, he was Dustin Hoffman, tooling across the Bay Bridge with the wind in his hair. In retrospect, this was telling me two things about people's relationship to technology. One was that romance and image go a long way towards shaping their opinions. If you doubt it, and if you have a lot of spare time on your hands, just ask anyone who owns a Macintosh and who, on those grounds, imagine him or herself to be a member of an oppressed minority. The other, somewhat subtler point was that interface is very important. Sure, the MGB was a lousy car in almost every way that counted: bulky, unreliable, underpowered, but it was fun to drive. It was responsive. Every pebble on the road was felt in the bones. Every nuance in the pavement transmitted instantly to the driver's hands. He could listen to the engine and tell what was wrong with it. The steering responded immediately to the commands from his hands. For a short time, he was extending his body and his senses into a larger realm and doing things that he couldn't do unassisted. The analogy between cars and operating systems is not half bad, and so let me run with it for a moment as a way of giving an executive summary of our situation today. Imagine a crossroads where four competing auto dealerships are situated. One of them, Microsoft, is much, much bigger than the others. It started out years ago selling 3-speed bicycles, MS-DOS. They were not perfect, but they worked, and when they broke, you could easily fix them. There was a competing bicycle dealership next door, Apple. That one day began selling motorized vehicles, expensive but attractively styled cars, with their innards hermetically sealed so that how they worked was something of a mystery. The big dealership responded by rushing a moped upgrade kit, the original Windows, onto the market. This was a Rube Goldberg contraption that, when bolted onto a 3-speed bicycle, enabled it to keep up just barely with Apple cars. The users had to wear goggles and were always picking bugs out of their teeth while Apple owners sped along in hermetically sealed comfort, sneering out the windows. But the micro mopeds were cheap and easy to fix compared with the Apple cars, and their market share waxed. Eventually, the big dealership came out with a full-fledged car, a colossal station wagon, Windows 95. It had all the aesthetic appeal of a Soviet worker housing block. It leaked oil and blew gaskets, and it was an enormous success. A little later, they also came out with a hulking off-road vehicle intended for industrial users, Windows NT, which was no more beautiful than the station wagon and only had a little more reliable. Since then, there have been a lot of noise and shouting, but little has changed. The smaller dealership continues to sell sleek Euro-styled sedans and to spend a lot of money on advertising campaigns. They have had going out of business signs taped up in their windows for so long that they have gotten all yellow and curly. The big one keeps making bigger and bigger station wagons and ORVs. On the other side of the road are two competitors that have come along more recently. One of them, BE Inc., is selling fully operational Batmobiles, the BEOS, and they are more beautiful and stylish even than the Euro sedans. Better design, more technologically advanced, and at least as reliable as anything else on the market, and yet cheaper than the others. With one exception, there is Linux, which is right next door, and which is not a business at all. It's a bunch of RVs, yurts, teepees, and geodesic domes set up in a field and organized by consciences. The people who live, and organized by consensus. The people who live there are making tanks. These are not old-fashioned cast-iron Soviet tanks. These are more like the M1 tanks of the U.S. Army, made of space-age materials and jammed with sophisticated technology from one end to the other. But they are better than Army tanks. They've been modified in such a way that they never ever break down, are light and maneuverable enough to use on ordinary streets, and use no more fuel than a subcompact car. These tanks are being cranked out on the spot at a terrific pace, and a vast number of them are lined up along the edge of the road with keys in the ignition. Anyone who wants can simply climb into one and drive it away for free. Customers come to this crossroads in throngs day and night. 90% of them go straight to the biggest dealership and buy station wagons or off-road vehicles. They do not even look at the other dealerships. Of the remaining 10%, most go and buy a sleek Euro sedan, pausing only to turn up their noses at the Philistines going to buy the station wagons and ORVs. If they even notice the people on the opposite side of the road selling the cheaper, technically superior vehicles, these customers deride them as cranks and half-wits. The Batmobile outlet sells a vehicle to the occasional car nut who wants a second vehicle to go with his station wagon, but seems to accept, at least for now, that it's a fringe player. The group giving away the free tanks only stays alive because it is staffed by volunteers, who are lined up at the edge of the streets with bullhorns trying to draw customers' attention to this incredible situation. A typical conversation goes something like this. Hacker with bullhorns. Save your money. Accept one of our free tanks. It is invulnerable, can drive across rocks and swamps at 90 miles an hour while getting 100 miles to the gallon. Prospective station wagon buyer. I don't know what you say is true, but I don't know how to maintain a tank. Bullhorn. You don't know how to maintain a station wagon either. Buyer. But this dealership has mechanics on staff. If something goes wrong with the station wagon, I can take a day off work, bring it in here, and pay them to work on it while I sit in the waiting room for hours, listen to elevator music. Bullhorn. But if you accept one of our free tanks, we will send volunteers to your house to fix it for free while you sleep. Buyer. Stay away from my house, you freak. Bullhorn. But, buyer, can't you see that everyone is buying station wagons? Yeah, before we go to the next chapter, I'd like to take a moment and give a little commentary. So this book was written in 1999. So it's just funny to listen to things about BEOS, BOS. I don't think I ever remember hearing about it. It was an OS that came out around 1990. It was trying to compete with the big boys, if you will. Eventually, though, it just didn't get market share. It just didn't get the traction that the company was looking for. So it got bought up by Palm, I think like 1998, around that time. Yeah, it was so obscure. I actually had to go look up the Wikipedia page on it just to get reference. It's like, oh yeah, now I remember. But it was also funny listening to Neal talk about like Apple users being a like persecuted minority. Wow. It's just kind of weird. Now you're like a hipster. You're the cool person if you get Apple. Some ways they're on even keel, if you will, or even, step with Microsoft. Interesting how things change. So with that in mind, let's get ready for the next chapter. Bitflinger. The connection between cars and ways of interacting with computers wouldn't have occurred to me at the time I was being taken for rides in the MGB. I had signed up to take a computer programming class at Ames High School. After a few introductory lectures, we students were granted admission to a tiny room containing a teletype, a telephone, and an old-fashioned modem consisting of a metal box with a pair of rubber cups on the top. Note, many readers making their way through that last sentence probably felt an initial pang of dread that this essay was about to turn into a tedious, codgirly reminiscence about how tough we had it back in the old days. Rest assured that I am actually positioning my pieces on the chessboard, as it were, in preparation to make a point about truly hip and up-to-date minute topics like open source software. The teletype was exactly the same sort of machine that had been used for decades to send and receive telegrams. It was basically a loud typewriter that could only produce uppercase letters. Mounted to one side of it was a smaller machine with a long reel of paper tape on it and had a clear plastic hopper underneath. In order to connect this device, which was not a computer at all, to the Iowa State University mainframe across town, you would pick up the phone, dial the computer's number, listen for strange noises, and then slam the headset down into the rubber cups. If your aim was true, one cup would wrap its neoprene lips around the earpiece and the other around the mouthpiece, consummating a kind of informational soixante neuf, or 69. The teletype would shudder as it was possessed by a spirit of the distant mainframe and begin to hammer out cryptic messages. Since computer time was a scarce resource, we used a sort of batch processing technique. Before dialing the phone, we would turn on the tape puncher, a subsidiary machine bolted to the side of the teletype, and type in our programs. Each time we depressed the key, the teletype would bash out a letter on the paper in front of us so we could read what we've typed. But at the same time, it would convert the letter into a set of 8 binary digits or bits and punch a corresponding pattern of holes across the width of the paper tape. The tiny discs of paper knocked out of the tape would flutter down into the clear plastic hopper, which would slowly fill up with what can only be described as actual bits. On the last day of the school year, the smartest kid in the class, not me, jumped out from behind the desk and flung several quarts of these bits over the head of our teacher, like confetti, as a sort of semi-affectionate practical joke. The image of this man sitting there, gripped in the opening stages of an atavistic fight or flight reaction with millions of bits, megabytes, sifting down out of his hair and into his nostrils and mouth, his face gradually turning purple as he built up to an explosion, is the single most memorable scene from my formal education. Anyway, it will have been obvious that my interaction with the computer was of an extremely formal nature, being sharply divided up into different phases, viz. 1. Sitting home with paper and pen, so miles and miles from any computer, I would think very, very hard about what I wanted the computer to do, and translate my intentions into a computer language, a series of alphanumeric symbols on a page. 2. I would carry this across a sort of informational cordon sanitaire, 3 miles of snowdrifts to school, and type those letters into a machine, not a computer, which will convert the symbols into binary numbers and record them visibly on a tape. 3. Then through the rubber cup modem, I would cause these numbers to be sent to the university mainframe, which would, 4, do arithmetic on them and send numbers back to the teletype. The teletype would convert these numbers back into letters and hammer them out on a page. And 6, I, watching, would construe the letters as meaningful symbols. The division of responsibilities implied by all of this is admirably clean. Computers do arithmetic on bits of information. Humans construe the bits as meaningful symbols. But distinction is now being blurred, or at least complicated, by the advent of modern operating systems that use and frequently abuse the power of metaphor to make computers accessible to a larger audience. Along the way, possibly because of those metaphors, which take an operating system, a sort of work of art, people start to get emotional, grow attached to pieces of software in the same sort of way my friend's dad did to his MGB. People who have only interacted with computers through graphical user interfaces, such as the Mac OS or Windows, which is to say almost everyone nowadays who has ever used a computer, may have been startled or at least bemused to hear about the telegraph machine that I used to communicate with a computer in 1973. But there was, as is, a good reason for using this particular kind of technology. Human beings have various ways of communicating to each other, such as music, art, dance, and facial expressions. But some of these are more amenable than others to being expressed as strings of symbols. Written language is the easiest of all because, of course, it consists of strings of symbols to begin with. If the symbols happen to belong to a phonetic alphabet, as opposed to, say, ideograms, converting them into bits is a trivial procedure, and one that was nailed technologically in the early 19th century, which is the introduction of Morse code and other forms of telegraphy. We possessed a human-computer interface 100 years before we had computers. When computers came into being around the time of the Second World War, humans quite naturally communicated with them by simply grafting them onto the already existing technology for translating letters into bits and vice versa, teletypes and punch card machines. These embody two fundamentally different approaches to computing. When you were using cards, you'd punch a whole stack of them and run them through the reader all at once, which was called batch processing. You could also do batch processing with a teletype, as I have already described, by using the paper tape reader, and we were certainly encouraged to use this approach when I was in high school. But though efforts were made to keep us unaware of this, the teletype could do something that the card reader could not. On the teletype, once the modem link was established, you could just type in a line and hit the return key. The teletype would send the line to the computer, which might or may not respond with some lines of its own, which the teletype would hammer out, producing, over time, a transcript of your exchange with the machine. This way of working did not even have a name at the time, but when much later an alternative became available, it was retroactively dubbed the command line interface. Then I moved on to college. I did my computing in large, stifling rooms where scores of students would sit in front of slightly updated versions of these same machines and write computer programs. These used dot matrix printing mechanisms, but were, from the computer's point of view, identical to the old teletypes. By that point, computers were better at time sharing. That is, mainframes were still mainframes, but they were better at communicating with a large number of terminals at once. Consequently, it was no longer necessary to use batch processing. Card readers were shelved out into hallways and boiler rooms, and batch processing became a nerds-only kind of thing, and consequently took on a certain eldritch flavor among those of us that even knew it existed. We were all off the batch and on the command line interface. Now, my very first shift in operating system paradigms. If only I'd known it. A huge stack of accordion fold paper sat on the floor underneath each one of those glorified teletypes, and miles of paper shuddered through their platens. Almost all this paper was thrown away or recycled without ever having been touched by ink, an ecological atrocity so glaring that those machines were soon replaced by video terminals, so-called glass teletypes, which were quieter and didn't waste paper. Again, though, from the computer's point of view, these were indistinguishable from World War II era teletype machines. In effect, we still use Victorian technology to communicate with computers until about 1984, when the Macintosh was introduced with its graphical user interface. Even after that, the command line continued to exist as an underlying stratum, a sort of brainstem reflex of many modern computer systems all through the heyday of graphical user interfaces, or GUIs, as I like to call them from now on. So, for today's session, I think that will be all. We had our introduction. We got into a couple of chapters. I want to add some comment to this. I find it really interesting how Neal Stephenson, born in the 50s, he talks about how computers operated in the early 70s when he was in high school. Because as a guy who was born in the 70s but spent his teenage years in the 80s when he went to high school, thankfully it was nothing like that. It was in the 1980s, it was pretty much like you had today: monitor, printer, keyboard, usually a mouse. Those were coming online. The big difference was the internet. The internet was the baud rate modems that, kind of like what he described. You had to take a phone and you had to put it on the modem, which had the two plastic cups that you would put each end of the phone on. It was very slow, and very simple games and programs would literally take all day just to get couple of sprites to move on the screen. My friend's dad had a Commodore 64. He loved that thing, and he would get on these bulletin board service, the predecessor to the World Wide Web of today. And yeah, it would take him all day to load simple games. But that was the best we had back in the 80s. So very interesting to see this history. It's good to learn from people who experienced it. So this will be all for now. But we will then, next time, go into, I don't know, we'll see how far it goes with us. We'll at least read a chapter or two. Thank you. Bye.